January 17, 1942. Dawn breaks cold over the hills of Santo Tomas, Manila. The air smells of damp earth and smoke. Through the iron gates of what was once a university, columns of women walk in silence. American nurses, British teachers, Dutch plantation wives, Australian missionaries. Their shoes are worn. Their dresses, once modest and proper, now hang loose from bodies, already beginning to thin. They carry bundles, blankets, photographs, a child's stuffed toy clutched against a chest. Behind them, Japanese soldiers stand rigid, bayonets fixed, faces unreadable in the gray light. The gates close with a metallic clang that echoes across the courtyard. This is Santo Tomas internment camp. This is the beginning. But this story does not begin here. It begins months earlier, in the smoke and chaos of Pearl Harbor, in the fall of Hong Kong, in the desperate hours before Singapore collapsed. It begins in the moment when the world realized that this war would spare no one, not soldiers, not civilians, not women, not children. The 20th century had already seen unspeakable horrors, but the Second World War would shatter every remaining illusion about the boundaries of human decency. And within that vast machinery of violence, a particular cruelty emerged: the systematic imprisonment of civilian women, hidden away in camps, scattered across Asia and Europe, forgotten by their own governments, invisible to the world. The women who entered these camps believed they understood suffering. They had lived through the Depression. They had said goodbye to husbands and sons. They had read the newspapers, listened to the radio broadcasts, understood that war was coming. But nothing, no preparation, no prayer, no inner fortitude, could have readied them for what awaited behind those gates. They expected hardship. They expected fear. What they could not have expected was the slow, methodical erasure of their humanity, the transformation of civilized women into skeletal shadows fighting over grains of rice, the collapse of every social structure that had once defined their lives. They could not have imagined that their bodies would become battlegrounds, their survival a form of resistance, their very existence a challenge to the ideologies that sought to break them. The Japanese soldiers who guarded these camps arrived with their own expectations. They had been told they were bringing order to Asia, liberating the East from Western imperialism, constructing a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. They had been raised in a culture that revered discipline, honor, and hierarchy. They had been taught that women were to be protected within their proper sphere, that femininity itself was a form of purity requiring preservation. Yet here they stood, overseeing thousands of white women, the wives and daughters of colonizers, representatives of the very powers that had humiliated Japan for a century. These were not combatants. They posed no military threat, but in the calculus of total war, they had become symbols, tools of psychological warfare, evidence of Western decline. The guards looked at these women and saw something that confused their training. They saw vulnerability, certainly, but also defiance. They saw bodies weakening from hunger, but also eyes that refused to lower. They saw desperation, but also an inexplicable resilience that persisted despite every rational reason to surrender. The Japanese command had anticipated that controlling civilian women would be simple, a matter of basic logistics: fences, rations, roll calls. What they had not anticipated was that these women would create, within the camps, entire civilizations of resistance: schools without books, hospitals without medicine, kitchens that transformed garbage into meals, communities that refused to die. Santo Tomas was the largest internment camp in the Philippines, holding over 4,000 civilians at its peak. The main building, once a university hall, became a warren of humanity, families sleeping on concrete floors, blankets strung between pillars to create the illusion of privacy. The Japanese allocated 2,400 square feet for every 200 people. This meant each person possessed, on average, 12 square feet of living space, an area smaller than a single bed. Women slept in rows, bodies pressed together, sharing breath and heat and the sounds of each other's nightmares. Food became the central obsession. The initial rations were inadequate but survivable: rice, vegetable stew, occasional bits of fish. But as the war progressed and Japan's supply lines stretched thin, the rations diminished. By 1944, each internee received approximately 960 calories per day, less than half of what a sedentary adult requires, a fraction of what active bodies need. The menu was monotonous: lugao, a thin rice gruel that offered volume without nutrition; talinum, a watery green vegetable that tasted of nothing; coffee made from roasted corn that stained the teeth and upset the stomach. The women watched their bodies change. Menstruation ceased not all at once, but gradually, the cycles becoming irregular, then stopping entirely as the body conserved its dwindling resources. Breasts flattened. Hip bones emerged like continental shelves. Hair thinned and fell out in clumps. Teeth loosened in gums, deprived of vitamins. Skin stretched tight over bones, translucent as parchment. They began to look like each other, the starvation erasing individual features, rendering them all into the same gaunt archetype. They called this look the Manila face. But they did not merely starve. They organized women of Santo Tomas, established a camp government, a system of committees that managed sanitation, education, food distribution, and entertainment. They formed a kitchen crew that worked miracles with the impossibilistry and rations, inventing recipes from vegetable peelings and rice bran. They planted gardens in every available space, growing tomatoes and beans and greens between barracks. They bartered and smuggled, trading jewelry and fountain pens for eggs and sugar, risking severe punishment to supplement the official rations. They created schools. Without textbooks, they taught from memory English literature recited by a former librarian, mathematics problems scratched in dirt with sticks, geography lessons drawn from shared remembrances of places they had once lived. Children sat in rows on the ground, their bellies hollow but their minds still hungry. The teachers stood before them, themselves weak with malnutrition, and insisted that education mattered, that the future existed, that knowledge was a form of wealth no guard could confiscate. They organized entertainment. There were concerts where women with trained voices sang opera arias in the tropical heat, their voices carrying across the camp in the evenings, transforming the squalid courtyard into something approaching beauty. There were plays performed, with costumes sewn from burlap sacks, scripts written on scraps of paper and memorized by actors who had been stenographers and housewives. There were lectures on art history, on classical music, on philosophied attempts to preserve the interior life, to prove that they remained more than mere Bodhis struggling to survive. Across the China Sea, in the British colony of Hong Kong, the fall came swiftly. On December 25, 1941, a date the internees would forever after call Black Christmas, the garrison surrendered. And the Japanese military swept through the city, rounding up enemy nationals. Women were separated from men, herded into temporary holding facilities, then transferred to Stanley internment camp on the southern tip of Hong Kong Island. Stanley was different from Santo Tomas Mala, more isolated, perched on a peninsula, surrounded by sea. The camp held approximately 2,800 internees in buildings, designed for perhaps half that number. The accommodations were former prison barracks and military quarters, concrete structures with barred windows and heavy doors. Privacy was impossible. Sanitation was primitive. The toilets were holes in the ground, open pits that bred flies and disease. The stench in summer was overwhelming. The women of Stanley faced particular vulnerabilities. The camp was under the authority of the Japanese military police, the Kemp Battalion organization known for its brutality. Guards conducted random searches, confiscating anything of value: watches, rings, fountain pens, photographs. Women who protested were slapped, beaten, locked in solitary confinement in tiny cells where they could neither stand nor lie fully extended. The message was clear: you possess nothing, you are nothing, you exist only by our permission. Yet even here, resistance flourished in subtle forms. The women developed elaborate systems to hide valuable sewing jewelry into hems, burying documents in sealed jars, creating false bottoms in suitcases. They established underground trading networks, exchanging goods with Chinese vendors who approached the camp fences at night, risking execution to sell vegetables and eggs. They maintained diaries, writing in tiny script on any available paper, documenting the daily humiliations and small victories, creating a record they prayed would someday be read. One woman, a British nurse named Phyllis Harrop, kept a detailed diary throughout her internment at Stanley. Her entries reveal the psychological warfare of camp life, the arbitrary rules that changed without notice, the sudden inspections designed to unsettle the guards who oscillated between indifference and cruelty. "We are not allowed to look at the guards directly," she wrote in March 1943. "To meet their eyes is considered insolent. Yet we are also punished if we fail to bow properly when they pass. We are expected to sense their presence without seeing them, to show deference while remaining invisible. It is exhausting, this performance of submission." In the Dutch East Indies, the fall came in stages. As Japanese forces advanced through the archipelago in early 1942, Dutch civilians, most of them women and children, as the men had been mobilized for defense, were ordered into internment camps. The camps were scattered across Java and Sumatra, repurposed from schools, convents, and administrative buildings. Unlike the mixed nationality camps in Manila and Hong Kong, these Dutch camps were more isolated, cut off from neutral observers and Red Cross visits. The Japanese command in the Indies implemented a particularly harsh policy. They separated women from men entirely, placing them in gender-segregated camps. Mothers were torn from teenage sons. Wives said goodbye to husbands with no idea when or if they would meet again. The women entered the camps carrying children, bundles, whatever they could manage. They found themselves in a world run entirely by women, for women. without the buffer of male authority that had structured their colonial lives. The camp at Judeng on the outskirts of Batavia, now Jakarta, became notorious. Under the command of Lieutenant Kenichi Sonaya, man remembered by survivors as the most sadistic of all camp commandants, Gedung was transformed into a laboratory of suffering. Sone implemented punishments for infractions so minor they seemed designed to be unavoidable. Women were beaten for bowing incorrectly, for smiling, for singing, for looking tired. He cut rations repeatedly, driving the daily caloric intake below 700 calories. He forbade the internees from growing gardens or supplementing their food in any way. He conducted inspections where women were forced to stand for hours in the sun, children fainting in their arms, while guards searched every possession. But Sune's cruelest innovation was psychological. He created a system where the women themselves had to enforce the rules, appointing internees as block leaders who would be held responsible for any infractions within their groups. This meant that the women had to police each other, to report violations, to participate in their own oppression. It was a brilliant strategy of division, turning communal solidarity into mutual surveillance, making survival dependent on collaboration, that even under Sone, the women of Judeng resisted. They developed silent communication systems, signals, coded phrases, innocuous conversations that conveyed warnings. They sabotaged the roll calls, deliberately miscounting to waste time and frustrate the guards. They hid the sickest women during inspections, covering for them, claiming they were on work detail elsewhere. They stole from the kitchens, from supply sheds, from anywhere, and shared the stolen goods collectively. A communism born of desperation. One recurring act of resistance was music. Despite repeated prohibitions, the women sang. They sang while working, while standing for roll call, while lying in the dark after curfew. They sang hymns and folk songs, lullabies, and national anthems. The singing served multiple purposes. It maintained morale, it created solidarity, it asserted their humanity, but it was also a direct challenge to the guards' authority on audible proof that they could not be silenced, that some part of them remained beyond reach. The German camps told a different story, though the suffering was no less real. In Europe, the Nazi regime imprisoned women in a complex hierarchy of facilities. Concentration camps for political prisoners, labor camps for those deemed racially inferior, internment camps for enemy nationals. The women who entered these systems faced dangers distinct from those in Asia, not starvation, rations, and tropical disease, but industrial-scale brutality, medical experiments, and the ever-present threat of the gas chambers. Ravensbrück, largest women's concentration camp, held over 130,000 prisoners during its operation. Located 50 miles north of Berlin, Ravensbrück was designed as a labor camp where women would be worked to exhaustion producing uniforms, munitions, and other war materials. The prisoners included political dissidents, resistance fighters, Jews, Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, prostitutes, and women classified as asocials, a category so broad it encompassed anyone the regime deemed undesirable. The conditions at Ravensbrück were industrial in their cruelty. Women worked 12-hour shifts in factories, standing at machines without breaks, their hands becoming infected from chemical exposure. They slept in wooden bunks stacked 3 high, 15 women sharing a space designed for 4. They received perhaps 1,200 calories daily more than the Asian camps, but still inadequate for hard labor. The death rate was staggering. Women died from exhaustion, from disease, from beatings, from medical experiments, from execution. By the end of the war, perhaps 30,000 had died within those walls. Yet Ravensbrück also became a site of extraordinary solidarity. The women developed what they called camp families, small groups who shared everything, supported each other through illness, mourned each other's deaths. These families crossed national and ethnic lines. A French resistance fighter would share her bread with a Polish Jew. A German political prisoner would nurse a Russian laborer through typhus. The families were survival units, but also moral statements, a refusal to let the camp's designed inhumanity destroy their capacity for love. The women also engaged in cultural resistance. They organized clandestine classes, teaching each other languages, mathematics, history, maintaining intellectual life despite the camp's efforts to reduce them to mere labor units. They celebrated birthdays and holidays with gifts fashioned from scraps, a flower drawn on a piece of paper, a poem recited from memory, a song sung in whispers. These gestures seemed small, but they were acts of profound rebellion, assertions that they remained people with interior lives, with pasts and futures, with identities beyond their prisoner numbers. The Allied soldiers who liberated these camps in 1945 were unprepared for what they found. The men of the 1st Cavalry Division who entered Santo Tomas in February 1945 expected to find prisoners, but they found ghosts. The internees weighed, on average, 30% less than when they had entered the camp. Their faces were skeletal. Their bodies moved slowly, conserving every calorie. Some could barely walk. The soldiers, young Americans, fed on 3 full meals daily. Bada, strong and healthy, stared at these women and could not reconcile what they saw with what they had imagined. One soldier, interviewed years later, described his first moments inside Santo Tomas. "We came through the gates expecting to be heroes. We expected tears, celebrations, gratitude. Instead, there was this strange silence. The internees just stared at us. They looked like they didn't believe we were real. Some of them reached out to touch our uniforms, like they needed physical proof. One woman started crying and couldn't stop. She just stood there, this tiny woman with white hair and enormous eyes, crying silently with tears running down her face. We didn't know what to do. We'd been trained to fight, not to witness this." The liberation of the European camps was even more traumatic. Soviet forces entering Ravensbrück in April 1945 found thousands of women too weak to move, lying in their bunks, barely conscious. British troops liberating camps in northern Germany encountered scenes of mass death, bodies stacked in piles. Survivors wandering among corpses, the living and the dead almost indistinguishable. The soldiers, hardened by years of combat, vomited. They wept. They could not comprehend the systematic nature of the cruelty, the bureaucratic efficiency of the suffering. But what disturbed the liberators most was the psychological state of the survivors. The women had adapted to captivity in ways that persisted beyond liberation. They hoarded food compulsively, hiding bread under pillows, secreting away rations they no longer needed. They struggled with the concept of privacy, uncomfortable sleeping alone. After years of communal existence, they startled at sudden movements, flinched from loud noises, scanned every room for exits. They had been transformed by their experience, and there was no simple path back to who they had been before. The symbolic object that haunts these stories is bread. In every camp, across every continent, bread became the measure of survival, the currency of exchange, the embodiment of both cruelty and kindness. Bread was what the guards withheld, reducing rations until bones showed through skin. Bread was what the women fought over, stealing from each other in desperate moments, then sharing in acts of grace. Bread was memory, the ghost of bakeries and kitchens, of normalcy and abundance, of a world where food was not scarce. In Santo Tomas, women traded wedding rings, 4 loaves of bread smuggled in by Filipino vendors. In Stanley, they baked bread-like substances from ground rice and water, calling it bread though it resembled nothing they had known before. In Gidang, they fantasized about bread, describing to each other in elaborate detail the breads they would eat after liberation: white bread with butter, toast with jam, fresh rolls warm from the oven. These conversations were a form of torture and comfort simultaneously, keeping alive the memory of plenty while emphasizing its absence. In Ravensbrück, bread became a moral test. The SS guards distributed it unevenly, giving larger portions to some prisoners than others, deliberately creating inequality and resentment. Some women stole bread from the weak, justifying their actions as survival. Others shared their portions with those too sick to work, knowing that this generosity might cost their own lives. The choice of what to do with bread, to hoard or to share, became the defining ethical question of camp existence. There is a story from Santo Tomas, told by multiple survivors, of a woman named Margaret who saved a small piece of bread for 300 days. She kept it wrapped in cloth, hidden in her belongings. She did not eat it during the worst periods of hunger. Even when she was faint with starvation, she saved it for a purpose. It was her daughter's birthday bread. Her daughter was in another camp, separated by miles and barbed wire. Margaret had no idea if her daughter was alive, but she kept the bread, determined that if they were ever reunited, she would have something to give this small, hard piece of bread, stale and probably inedible, but precious beyond measure, because it represented hope, because it meant she had never stopped being a mother. When liberation came and Margaret was finally reunited with her daughter, she gave her the bread. The daughter, herself Skelito, looked at this desiccated object and understood everything it meant. They held each other and wept, and then witnesses say they broke the bread in half and ate it together. This bread that was 300 days old, that tasted of dust and survival, that was the most valuable thing either of them had ever possessed. The guards could not understand what the architects of these camps never anticipated was that cruelty has limits as a tool of control. You can starve bodies, confine them, beat them, humiliate them, but there exists within the human spirit something that resists even total domination. The women in these camps discovered this something. They called it by different names: faith, stubbornness, love, duty, hope. But whatever they named it, it manifested in the same behaviors. The refusal to surrender completely, the maintenance of small dignities, the creation of community in the midst of designed isolation. The Japanese guards at Santo Tomas were rotated regularly, a deliberate policy to prevent them from forming attachments to the prisoners. But this policy backfired in unexpected ways. Each new set of guards arrived expecting to find broken women, submissive and defeated. Instead, they found a functioning society, women running schools and hospitals, organizing concerts and lectures, maintaining hygiene and order despite every obstacle. The guards were supposed to be the agents of civilization, bringing order to chaos. Instead, they found that the prisoners had created civilization within captivity, that their fences and guns were all that separated two different kinds of order. Some guards were troubled by this. They had been told these women were weak, soft, dependent on men, but day after day, they watched these supposedly inferior women display capabilities that contradicted the propaganda. They saw women carry children through illness without medicine. They saw women improvise solutions to impossible problems. They saw women maintain morale in conditions that would have broken most soldiers. This created cognitive dissonance. The women were supposed to be beneath them, yet they demonstrated strengths that commanded respect. A few guards acted on this dissonance, providing small mercies as a warning before an inspection, an extra portion of rice, a blind eye to a rule violation. These acts were rare and dangerous. Guards caught showing leniency could be severely punished, but they happened, and the women remembered them. In the testimonies collected after the war, survivors distinguished between guards who had been uniformly cruel and those who had shown moments of humanity. This distinction mattered. It meant that even within a system designed to dehumanize, individual choice persisted, that people could resist the roles assigned to them, even when those roles came with the force of military authority. The liberation did not end the suffering, it merely transformed it. The women who emerged from the camps faced a world that did not know what to do with them. They were repatriated to countries that had changed in their absence. They returned to families who could not understand what they had experienced. They discovered that their homes had been sold, their possessions looted, their pre-war lives erased. They were expected to be grateful, to resume normal life, to not dwell on the past. But normal life was impossible. The women had been fundamentally altered by their captivity. They suffered from malnutrition-related illnesses that would plague them for decades. Osteoporosis from calcium deficiency, heart problems from prolonged starvation, dental issues from vitamin loss. They bore psychological scars that had no name. In the 1940s, what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, but which was then dismissed as nerves or women's problems. Many struggled with survivor's guilt. They had lived while others died. They made choices about food, about compliance, about self-preservation that haunted them. They wondered if they could have done more, saved more, resisted more. They carried the faces of the dead with them. Women who had slept beside them, shared meals with them, died in their arms. The living bore witness to the dead, and this bearing was a burden that never lightened. The world, meanwhile, moved on with remarkable speed. The war ended. The soldiers came home. Economies rebuilt. New crises emerged. The women's stories were relegated to the margins, considered less important than combat narratives. When they tried to tell what had happened to them, they found that people did not want to hear. The stories were too dark, too disturbing, too challenging to the triumphant narratives of Allied victory. So many women fell silent, locking their experiences away, speaking of them only to each other, or not at all. It took decades for the full truths of the women's camps to emerge. Historians gradually pieced together the records, camp diaries, official documents, oral testimonies collected from aging survivors. What emerged was a picture of suffering on an immense scale, but also of resilience that defied easy categorization. These were not stories of passive victory. They were stories of active survival, of women who fought back using the only weapons available to them: community, creativity, and an unbreakable commitment to preserving their humanity. The experience of the camps exposed fundamental truths about ideology and power. The Japanese military had believed that their system, disciplined, hierarchical, devoted to the emperor and the nation, represented the pinnacle of civilization. The Western women they imprisoned were supposed to be proof of democratic decadence, of the weakness inherent in individualism and equality. Yet the camps revealed the opposite. The women created democratic micro-societies within captivity, proving that self-governance could flourish even under conditions of extreme deprivation. Their resilience demonstrated that strength comes not from rigid hierarchy, but from mutual support and shared purpose. The Nazi ideology held that some humans were inherently superior to others, that Aryan blood conferred value while Jewish or Slavic blood warranted extermination. The women's camps tested this ideology and found it hollow. In Ravensbrück, women from every background proved equally capable of courage, equally deserving of dignity. The qualities that mattered for survival: compassion, ingenuity, solidarity, had nothing to do with race or nation. The camp families that formed across ethnic lines were living refutations of Nazi doctrine. Quiet but powerful assertions that humanity is indivisible. The guards who witnessed this faced an uncomfortable reality. The prisoners were not inferior. The ideology was wrong. Some guards retreated into greater cruelty, doubling down on brutality to avoid confronting this truth. But others minority, certainly, but not an insignificant number, began to question. They saw the women's strength and wondered whether strength had been properly defined. They saw the women's community and wondered whether their own isolated discipline was actually a form of weakness. These doubts were dangerous, rarely spoken aloud, but they existed. The prisoners had won a victory that went beyond mere survival, had planted seeds of doubt in the minds of their captors. There's a photograph that circulates among reporters, taken at Santo Tomas on the day of liberation. It shows a group of women standing in the courtyard, looking at the camera. They are painfully thin, their clothes hang loose, but their eyes are clear, and several are smiling, not broad, joyous smiles, but small, knowing smiles that suggest they have understood something profound. In the foreground stands a woman holding a child. The child is perhaps 4 years old, too young to remember life before the camp. The woman's hand rests protectively on the child's head, and her expression is complex. Relief, exhaustion, love, and something that might be pride. This photograph circulates because it captures something essential about the women's experience. They survived, but more than that, they preserved the future. The children in the camps, those who made it through, were living proof that the attempt to break these women had failed. Every child who survived was an act of resistance, a refusal to let the camp system extinguish the next generation. Women had starved themselves to feed children, had shielded them from the worst of the violence, had maintained schools and routines to give them normalcy. They had done this knowing they might not survive, but determining that the children would. This is the legacy that matters. The camps were designed to demonstrate the powerlessness of these women, to prove that they were insignificant, that they could be erased without consequence. Instead, the camps revealed the opposite, that these women possessed a strength their captors could neither understand nor defeat. They maintained civilization in the midst of barbarism. They created beauty in the presence of ugliness. They loved when they were surrounded by hate. They did not do this because it was easy or because they were saints. They did it because they were human, and they refused to surrender that humanity. The sun sets over Santo Tomas now, 7 decades after liberation. The buildings still stand, repurposed once again as university facilities. Students walk the courtyards where prisoners once stood for roll call. Classrooms fill the spaces where women once slept 15 to a room. The physical traces of suffering have been erased, painted over, renovated into normalcy. But the memory persists. It persists in the testimonies carefully archived in libraries and museums. It persists in the gatherings of survivors fewer each year now, as time claims what war could not who meet, to remember the dead and honor the living. It persists in the families of survivors, children and grandchildren who grew up with stories whispered at kitchen tables, with mothers and grandmothers who hoarded food or startled at loud noises or could not bear to waste a single grain of rice. The truth about the women's POW camps is not comfortable. It cannot be reduced to simple narratives of good versus evil, victory versus defeat. It is a truth that acknowledges the capacity for cruelty that exists within systems, within ideologies, within ordinary people given power over others. But it is also a truth that affirms the resilience of the human spirit, the power of community, the strength that emerges when people refuse to be reduced to victims. Those women are American and British, Dutch and Australian, German and Polish, and Russian. They were not warriors in the traditional sense. They did not carry weapons or storm beaches or fly bombers, but they fought a war nonetheless, a war against despair, against dehumanization, against the forces that sought to erase them. And they won. Not completely. They bore scars. They buried friends. They lost years they could never reclaim. But they won in the way that mattered most. They remained themselves. They did not allow their captors to define them. They did not become what the camps tried to make them. There is a moment, recorded in multiple testimonies, from the day of liberation at Santo Tomas, as the American soldiers distributed real food, fresh bread and meat and fruit. An old woman took a piece of bread and held it to her face. She did not eat it immediately. She smelled it, felt its weight, examined its texture, and then she began to cry. Not tears of joy, exactly, though joy was present, but tears of recognition, of return, of homecoming to a world where bread was not scarce, where survival was not a daily battle, where she could be human again in the fullest sense of the word, that bread, warm in her hands, was more than food. It was a symbol of everything the camps had tried to destroy and failed to extinguish. Abundance, generosity, the basic covenant of civilization that says we will care for each other, and no one will starve while others feast, that humanity is defined not by power, but by compassion. It was a symbol of freedom, not just political freedom, though that mattered, but the deeper freedom to be fully oneself, to live without fear, to plan for a future that extends beyond the next meal. The women took that bread, they ate it slowly, savoring every bite, and then they began the long journey home, not just the physical journey to countries and families, but the interior journey back to themselves, to the people they had been before the gates closed. and to the new people they had become through survival. It was a journey many would never complete, but they made it nonetheless, carrying with them the memory of those who did not survive, the lessons learned in captivity, and the unshakable knowledge that they had faced the worst humanity could devise, and emerged, somehow, still human. This is the truth about the women's POW camps of World War II. Not that they were places of unrelieved horror, though horror was present. Not that the women were merely victims, though they were victimized. But that within the machinery of industrial cruelty, ordinary women performed extraordinary acts of resistance. They built communities where their captors intended isolation. They created beauty where ugliness was mandated. They loved where hate was the rule. They survived, and in surviving, they testified to a truth larger than any ideology, that the human capacity for resilience exceeds the human capacity for cruelty. That community is stronger than coercion. That love in all its forms is the final, unconquerable fortress of the human spirit. The bread they held that day of liberation was proof of this truth. And so they ate, and so they remembered, and so they lived to tell the story, which is both unbearably dark and illuminated by an inextinguishable light.